Today we are making a bandit camp map twice. The first iteration is from the third person perspective and resembles more of a regular town map. The second iteration is a recreation of the whole thing from the top down perspective. Before we begin, if you want access to these maps, the quests they're a part of, or you just want to support the channel, then head over to the Patreon, and huge shout out to everyone who already has. To kick off the procedure, we'd, as always, take a minute to plan out the map and make a blueprint. So with this bandit camp, it's going to be useful to remember that it is in the mountains here, right? So we're going to want to work on having some different layers of elevation. It's definitely something I want to sort of put into the mix. So, you know, we're going to have maybe some cliffs here and some cliffs here. And that's going to be one of like the tricky things about this map, is it's going to have that verticality to it, similar to our ambush map in some ways. On top of that, we're obviously going to have walls. You know, which we're going to pen around the map like this. I think we can also have some watchtowers, and it can probably be a pretty substantial camp that's going to have like actual buildings, and maybe we have like a little bit of tent setups like that. And maybe the walls aren't just all the way around, but rather there's like actual mountains here like this, and that's kind of what blocks it off. After placing the palisade walls, we'd commit to the mountain backdrop by making the mountain stamps huge and then only having the base of them appear, getting across the energy that the camp is nestled neatly at the base of some mountains. As can sometimes happen though, these stamps' interaction with the ground was a little strange. So I had in the back of my mind we'd need to work on how these two could smoothly gel together. Moving down from the mountains, we'd look towards adding some cliff stamps to act as hills, bring some vertical dynamism to the map, something I try to do when I can. With these base elements giving us our structure, we'd move to the deployment of buildings, and flicking through the options led to a slight change of architectural style. I think the orc camp stuff's kind of interesting, and I think maybe we can actually lean on that a little bit. Yeah, this kind of it is orc, but it has good bandit camp vibes, most definitely. Okay, cool, I like that. This stylish of orcish stamps over standard camp stamps was a small change, but I liked the vibe that they brought. However, from here on out, we wouldn't just willy-nilly flood the map with orc stamps. We'd incorporate a few different styles to get the energy of a varied multicultural collective. More so, rather than just filling the whole map with tents and huts, I wanted to be really specific about what the other buildings would be. On top of this, I wanted the chosen infrastructure to narratively flesh out the camp and also impact the possible battle encounter. So we'd start this by creating a little garden where one of the pumpkins would be a necro jack-o'-lantern controlled by the gardener. But we'd do more than just this. I think we can, when we create our bandits, we can have like a couple different roles in the camp. So we kind of created a little garden, and I was thinking about creating a stable as well. That could be fun to like maybe have over here. As we create these different roles as we fill out the camp, we can have the enemies associated with that. So another role that could be is like a blacksmith. You could have like a construct enemy that's in the blacksmith. And a lot of these, it's like, yes, there are bandits, but like there's a lot of associated companions to each of those bandits that relate to each of the roles they fulfill in the camp. And that could be one way of A, providing us like direction for what we're going to use to fill out this camp, but B, also giving us direction for the type of battle bandits that we're going to have. Placing down these buildings would present a perfect launching pad for fleshing out who these bandits are, not just on an individual level, but as a group. I think like narratively, you know, we can have this blacksmith here, and the dwarven buildings, okay, well the dwarven buildings are related to the assembly line. And even though this is like a collection of ex-soldiers from Magasan, I think it would make a lot of sense that maybe they have connections with someone from the TLA. And one of the bandits in the camp is actually also part of the TLA, and they are maybe making the sort of weaponry and the sort of like industry or industrial items that the TLA used to take over Magasan. And we can have that ex-Magasani soldiers and some ex-TLA soldiers banded together to become bandits. To refine and expand this out a bit, we'd have the camp originally founded by ex-Magisan soldiers who have semi-fled their homeland decades ago after the TLA defeated them in a war, and then subsequently entirely annexed their nation. On top of this, some of the founding members are TLA defectors who switched sides during the war, like the blacksmith. Since then, they've recruited new, fresh faces to join in their general trifling, making them a mixed bunch. There's much more to it than this, but that's the general overview. As this map is also meant more as a scene map, I decided to pop down some people as well.
I think it's definitely a fun idea to actually like maybe put everyone on the map, because if we're gonna have this, a preview map of when they sort of are like investigating and going into the world, and then we switch to the top-down perspective, I think we can just have everybody on the map during that initial scout or the initial sort of dialogue or the scenes that play out.
Back to map making, and our problem with the mountain's base weirdly connecting to the ground would be fixed by some good old-fashioned nature.
As I've been saying, I think this is a little bit janky, and the trees are actually doing a good job of sort of disguising that, and I think maybe we can even add some like bushes here. Those are too big. Let's chuck these down. We can even add some bushes here to help disguise that even further.
After adding some rocks, barrels, a little pond, and a few other things to give the map that extra level of detail, we'd finish off with some clouds and the mountain to really give the energy that they were starting to enter some foggy, higher altitude terrain.
You know what? I actually think adding all of these clouds, giving the sense that they're kind of in the mountains a bit more, it actually does look pretty good. I think that adds to the atmosphere.
With our third-person perspective map complete, we'd turn our attention to figuring out the leaders of the camp.
The acting leader could be a Goliath barbarian, but the actual leader could be a broken down warforged that is like the one who does most of the thinking for the bandits.
We'd keep discussing the leaders and the various other members of the camp, all of which would lead to some really interesting enemies for combat, but also would lead to some great characterization for when the party meet and talk to these banditos. Characterization we'd use for creating a quest option where the party side with the bandits and help them get freedom from the bounty hunters tracking them down and trying to kill them. For now though, it was on to recreating this map, but from a top-down perspective.
So obviously the big challenge with this map is going to be like sort of seeing what exists and what doesn't in the two varying maps. And already it's like, yeah, these are the Palisades, but they're at a bit of a funky angle, and the struts are like really strutting out, because if they were bigger, let's say, the struts are like really on the map. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's fine. Maybe that's what we do.
This was not fine though, nor is it what we would do. For the Palisades specifically, we would be able to find some other walls that were perfectly top down. Then we added some separate stick stamps to create the struts. And this comboing of items to better represent the stamps was a technique we'd use frequently. However, this wasn't always possible, and when it wasn't, we'd try to get as close as possible. But we'd need to allow ourselves to be more representative with its design.
They don't have anything that really demonstrates a mountainside, so I think this is one of the things where we're going to have to probably be the most interpretable and the most sort of lenient with our exhibition of this. So yeah, not only is it going to look a little like inaccurate, but it's also going to be off in the sense of the color, right? I think that looks pretty good as far as the line goes. You know, it pretty much represents the second line here. Maybe this actually goes a little further down, but that's okay generally. I would say it looks pretty good.
When it came to the walls and cliffs and any of the real base elements, getting them as close as possible at the start was super important, because I'd later have to readjust any element where I'd done it poorly or slightly inaccurately. And the more things on the map, the more I'd have to change and move. And in hindsight, I probably should have spent more time trying to make this near perfect at the start, rather than employing my standard, fairly casual, close is good enough approach. Nailing it straight from the beginning is a tall order though, because the fewer items on the map, the harder it is to tell when perspective, sizing, placement, orientation, and so on are correct and when they're off. I should have placed the grids down and then used that to guide the placement of the items and everything else I just described, but I literally just thought of that now while I'm recording the audio. So I don't know, you live and you learn. I'll do that next time. Moving past this, we'd get to the biggest difference between the available corresponding stamps and the two maps in general. Buildings, which we'd luckily be able to work around rather effectively.
I guess one of my questions sort of is like, do we want to be able to see inside the hut to have sort of internal fighting terrain? And part of me wants to say yes, but I guess a bigger part of me is a bit more like, how would we do that? I guess we could do these orc walls. Oh, interesting. Oh, here we go. Wait, here we go. Here we go. It's happening. It's happening. Awesome. Yeah, I definitely think having these open composite like tent things is going to be better than having that, because I want the party to be able to go inside the tents and I want it to be a very full combat experience where it feels external and internal. So I'm really glad they have those.
As we did with the Palisades, this hut would require us to blast together a whole collections of items to make it look as closely replicated as possible. And this was one of the more fun and satisfying process of this recreation. Recognizing that something didn't really have a direct counterpart and making it look pretty much the same by cramming 3, 4, or even 5 items together, using clever layering and warping of their height and width felt amazing. And as someone who has been getting a lot better with Incarnate, it very much felt like I was able to use the program to achieve my goals in ways I wasn't able to even a couple months ago. This is something we'd very much do for the garden, resizing the farm texture so it had the same dimensions, changing the shape of the same piece of wood over and over again so there'd be the same irregular sizing as the third-person perspective garden's fence, while layering square wood blocks on top to act as the fence posts, while somewhat poorly scrunching together a few plants to embody the plans we had on our other map. It didn't look perfect, but I was really happy with the result, and trying to make this work was an engaging puzzle of sorts. During this map making, one small thing I noticed was that recreating a map would slightly change the ordering of our stamp and texture placement, and one example of this was roads.
So what I was thinking is I could do the roads, right? I haven't done the roads, but I'm going to leave them. And the reason is because I keep making small tweaks and little changes and things like that. And I think it would make a lot of sense to basically have the map entirely done before I go through and place the roads, because the roads are going to be a lot harder to change because I can't just pick them up and drag them like I can like that. So yeah, roads are usually put down first, but let's do it later. Something a little different for this.
As we moved on to trees, we'd also see how the stamp's sizing and perspective differences would affect some of the small placement minutiae of the map.
Probably not going to be the same amount of trees, honestly, because when we do trees in the third-party perspective, I kind of group them all together much more naturally, much more unnaturally than I would usually, and that gets the effect. If we look here, the trunks are really, really close together, and we can have 2 there. And it looks good in this regard, but when we go back to here, 1 tree sort of fits there, and I only put 4 trees there rather than the 6 or so I had as well. And that's the sort of stuff where it's just like, it is just slightly different.
These trees, and later the bushes and clouds as well, would be really helpful at disguising the obtusely bold outline of the cliff stamps we were using to represent our mountains. Having the unfortunately prominent black edges covered in clouds, as well as under tree canopies or behind bushes, would make all of this seem a lot more naturally integrated. Funnily, making this a situation where the same issue, in this case the mountains interacting with the ground weirdly, would be exhibited differently but solved the same way on both maps. Something that might seem like it would be common, but this was actually way more atypical than I was anticipating. Onto our stable recreation, and during this I'd reflect on the greatest challenge that map recreation was presenting.
One of the things about like replicating this map is like, usually I would just like be very free and I would just sort of like do what I want to do, and I wouldn't necessarily be thinking like crazy too hard about it. It's like I just sort of place it where I want to place it, and it's like if I think it looks good, I think it looks good. And with this like recreation, it's like I'm so beholden to another map. I have such a blueprint that I'm trying to follow and recreate that, you know, that creativity or that allowance of like when things don't work properly, I just sort of like, you know, try again or try something different. It's like, well, if something doesn't work properly, I sort of don't have too many other options I can go for. And it's definitely like interesting to be in a situation where that's sort of the truth, where you're kind of like, well, I need to make this work. If this doesn't work, I'm not really sure what to do. But that's like part of what has been making this kind of interesting is that challenge of like, oh, okay, well, how do I make this work? Like this is the situation, these are the resources I have, and this is like what I need to achieve. And I've been enjoying that aspect of it, even if it has made it a little bit tricky in some places, or in many places, to be honest.
Conversely, one of the advantages of recreating this map twice is getting to decorate the interiors for these houses. For the blacksmith, we gave the building a little workshop to visualize the repairs they do on the Warforged, along with the creation of constructs they do, and we filled it with weapons to imply that they also make weapons. We also chucked a bed in the kitchen to show that the camp has grown in size, but they haven't fully expanded the housing to match it. These small elements work as little bits of storytelling, but having more assets visible, such as as weapons might impact how the party interact with the world. With little left to complete, we'd go from building our pond area, which I maybe did the best job of recreating, to the watchtower, the area I was most concerned about recreating.
They're the thing I've been looking at the whole time going like, ooh, I don't know how I'm gonna do that. Legitimately, like, do not know what I'm gonna do.
I wanted the watchtower to have the same see-throughable style as the hut and house, but after some tests and discussion with chat, we decided to keep it simple for ourselves, placing some of the top-down orc watchtower stamps and calling it a day.
How much can you actually add inside the towers? I don't think they need to have that much detail. Yeah, I think that's a good point as well. It's like, what am I really gonna do there? You know, it would probably just be a little bit more open and just sort of show that like there's people inside or whatever, but I think we can maybe get that across by just having, say, the towers there, and we can just like put our little miniatures, or if we're playing online, you know, whatever, just the de facto miniatures on top. It's not a perfect one-to-one, but it looks pretty good, I think. The towers and the towers. Okay.
We'd add our last couple of items where, once again, I think there'd be literally no substitute, only to be pleasantly surprised.
Oh, perfect. I was just saying like, you know, there's not going to be anything, and scrolling through and finding the wagon is exactly what we want to do. So there we go.
To cap off, I would go through and finally paint the road, which would emphasize the areas where I'd gotten the perspective wrong. Luckily, this wasn't too common, and in the areas where it was off, it was pretty accurate, so I was more than satisfied. And with this, we'd be done.
Awesome. We have finished our 2 maps. We started here with our 3D perspective, and it went really well. It was a lot of fun to do. We were very free, and the biggest kind of most obvious difference between the two is when making this, it was very strange being like entirely beholden and trying to like replicate rather than just like letting artistic, you know, desire fly in whatever way I wanted, where usually I'd just be like, I want to put it like this, and I would just do whatever. And instead I was like, oh, I have to make the stable to be the same as the stable here, and you know, this building to be this building, right? And that was a little bit difficult, and that was especially difficult because a lot of these stamps don't correlate. Like, there are similar ones, but they aren't perfectly the same. So the cliffs is a good example of that, or it's like hard to get the same depth and perception on the cliffs because they're simply not the same. This is probably my favorite thing, where it's like, this is like a hell bridge with like a little thing there. That's a lava puddle that we've like shaped to be really specific size. You can see they're also stacked on top of each other. And then, you know, we have sort of this steampunk furnace in the background to maybe indicate that's where it's coming from. And being sort of smart about it and using these anvils, like, you know, even this, the anvils have 2 sides, but these ones only have 1 and they're stacked on top of each other. Like, that was a ton of fun to do. And having to be creative, forced to be creative about which stamps actually look the same, has probably one of my most, I really liked, basically. So yeah, and I'm keen to kick it out where it's like, you know, the parties start here, they have no grid on the map, and it's just like, oh yeah, you're doing a little conversation, it's all dialogue, it's diplomacy, and then shit kicks off, and then bam, battle map mode. I think it's going to be a lot of fun to have that switch during a session. So really happy with how these 2 maps came along. I think they both individually look good, and as collectives, I think they're a fun combo.
And that's the video. You can purchase these 2 maps as a bundle on my Etsy store, or you can subscribe to the Patreon, which will support the channel, but will also get you access to every quest and map I've ever made. Join the Twitch to help us make maps and quests live, subscribe to the channel for more D&D content like this. Thanks for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye!